Introducing Tracy Angwin, CEO of Australian Payroll Association, a prominent industry innovator on multiple fronts who is on a mission to help employers get payroll right. Tracy's efforts as a thought leader in the field have led to Australia's first nationally accredited payroll qualifications, the Certificate 4 in Payroll Administration and Diploma of Payroll Management. We welcome Tracy Angwin to throw a spotlight on payroll in Australia.
Hello from Australia. My name's Tracy Angwin, and this session is Spotlight on Australia. If you've got any questions during this presentation, please put the question in the chat box and I'll be available to answer it. Many times I've seen all sorts of surveys asking which is the most complicated payroll in the world. And you don't often see Australia on that list. But I'm here to tell you that Australia is certainly one of the most complicated payrolls in the world. I think because there are only sort of 12, 13 million working Australians, we probably don't see so much of that complexity globally. But I'm here today just to take you through some of the differences that you'll need to know about if you're processing Australian payroll. So what is unique about Australian payroll? Well, we have, I could tell you everything that's unique about Australian payroll, but it would take about 2 days. Our introduction to Australian payroll training course is about 2 days long. So we've only got, in fact, we've only got a few, sort of 15, 20 minutes. So I'm going to concentrate on 3 separate areas of Australian payroll that are quite unique to Australia. The first is awards and agreements. These are the legislative instruments whereby Australians are paid. The second is long service leave, Australia being the only country in the world that has long service leave. And the third is what we call superannuation guarantee, or SG. So firstly, awards and agreements. These, we used to have in Australia literally thousands of state and federal awards across all industries. There were thousands of these. In 2010, the government led by the Julia Gillard's Labor Party consolidated all of those awards and agreements into 122 modern awards, which cover the majority of Australian workforce. Now, the complication, of course, is that you can have your own agreements. You can have an award that just covers your workplace, and we call that an EA, an enterprise agreement, or an EBA, an enterprise bargaining agreement. No matter what your EA or EBA says, it has to at least cover the conditions of the relating modern award. So even if you've got your own EA, you need to understand the provisions in the award that is relevant to your employees. And most employers have multiple awards, so it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. What I wanted to talk to you specifically about today is the mistakes that we see in employers interpreting these awards and agreements. And that can be interpreting the modern awards, or in fact, the mistakes made in interpreting your own enterprise agreement. As I say, we do our course on introduction to awards is a full day. So I've only got a few minutes. So I just wanted to go through with you some examples of the basic things that a lot of employers get wrong. The first thing I wanted to talk about is span of hours. So each award or industrial agreement will have what's called a span of hours. And these are the hours that we reasonably expect an employee to work with no penalties or overtime outside of the actual overtime and penalties agreement in the award. So, for example, it might say that you have a span of hours from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And inside of those span of hours, we can reasonably accept employees to work without penalties. Now, what happens when an employee works outside of those? There may be penalties that apply or overtime. A good example of that is we've had a client recently who is in a particular industry that starts quite early, and their span of hours start from 6:30 in the morning. Now, based on their employees wanting to come into work early, because what they want to do is come in at 6 o'clock in the morning so they finish their shift and can pick up their children from school. So because the employees wanted it, the employer allowed them to start their shift at 6 o'clock in the morning, not 6:30. The problem is that when they were audited, they realized that they were working their employees outside the standard span of hours. And therefore, for that first 30 minutes of every shift, those employees were entitled to overtime. So they've had to do a back pay on 200 or 300 employees to pay them overtime for the first half an hour of every shift that they've done that's started before 6:30. And that back pay is well over $1 million. So these small errors can add up to quite substantial back pays. The second common problem that we see is rate increments. So this is when, for example, your award or agreement might say that on an anniversary or on someone's birthday, when they go from 18 to 19 to 20, for example, they might have an increase in their rate of pay. Now, most payroll systems are not set up to do this automatically, so a lot of this gets missed. So often we'll find that the calculations are correct, but the actual rate of pay is too low. The third thing that we see really commonly an issue is choosing the correct award, because awards often, you can have awards based on your industry. So, for example, if I'm in the manufacturing industry, I might think I've got a manufacturing award, but I might have, someone who's not covered in the manufacturing award, so might need a different award for that person. So it can be quite complicated to ensure that your employees, for all the different jobs that they do, are covered by the correct awards. The next one is what we call the BOOT, Better Off Overall Test, or annualized salaries. Now, a lot of employers have got themselves into trouble with this recently, and that is, essentially, you can pay your employees however you like, as long as they are getting the conditions that they would have been afforded under the relevant award. So if you're going to pay someone a salary, for example, it needs to cover everything that would have been covered under the award. Now, the big mistake here is when employees work outside the span of hours or go into overtime. So, for example, we've had a major retailer in Australia that's had this issue. They've had their store supervisors working on salaries, call it $75,000 a year, and then, but because those it's a 7-day-a-week business, a lot of those, or most of those supervisors are working Saturdays, Sundays, evenings, so they would, under the award, be entitled to overtime or penalty rates. When you actually work out the hours that they work, the employer has found out that doesn't actually, the actual base salary, the $75,000, hasn't actually covered what they would have been paid under the award. And in this particular instance, the underpayment goes into hundreds of millions of dollars. So again, it can be a big problem if you get that one wrong. And the last one I wanted to talk to you about is overtime versus penalty rates. Very commonly, these things are used incorrectly. Overtime is when there'll be an overtime clause in your award or agreement, and that will talk about when you're paid a percentage loading on the rate of pay, generally for working longer hours. So it might be that after 8 hours a day, you get paid overtime first 2 hours at time and a half, then double time, or it might be after 38 hours a week, you get first 2 at time and a half, and then therefore double time after that. That would be overtime. Penalty rates are more related to shifts. So it's a morning shift penalty. It's an evening shift penalty. It might be a Saturday or Sunday loaded penalty. That is not overtime. That is a penalty based on the shift that you're doing. Really important to understand the difference between those, especially when it comes to superannuation, which we'll be talking about shortly. Now, the regulator of awards and agreements is a federal agency called Fair Work. They are very active and can come and audit any employer at any time. And regularly, they will actually go through industries. So you'll find that they'll just hit, the restaurant industry or the retail industry. So you need to be aware of that as well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is long service leave. If you don't do payroll in Australia, you've likely not even heard of this. So we have 8 states and territories in Australia, and each of them have slightly differing long service leave legislation. Most of these legislations go back to the 1950s. And the reason we have long service leave is, if you haven't already realized, Australia's a long way from most of the rest of the world. So immigrants would come generally from Europe. And after 10 years service, it was thought that they should have around about 2 months leave, because that's how long it took to go back to Europe. So this is legislated in all states and territories, but as I say, the actual detail of the legislation is different. And that includes how you calculate long service leave and how you pay it. Now, to give you an example of that, in New South Wales, for example, when you calculate long service leave, and long service leave, by the way, is calculated always in weeks, not in hours or days, and it's generally based on the value of a week currently, and sometimes that has to be compared to 12 months or 5 years ago. So there are no payroll systems in Australia that do this automatically, certainly that I know of. So every time you calculate long service leave, it needs to be in weeks, and it needs to be some sort of manual calculation to make sure that you've covered the greater of the current, or the 12-month prior, or the 5-year prior, or whatever it is the state legislation is that you're paying on. Now, that can have huge implications when people have gone from full-time to part-time, or part-time to full-time, or casual to full-time. So it's really important that you know for each state and territory that you're paying long service leave for, how the leave is calculated and paid. For example, in New South Wales, and in fact all of the states, there are all sorts of different reasons why you may or may not pay long service leave, and how you might calculate it. So, for example, in New South Wales, if you take long service leave, an employee takes that time, takes their 1 or 2 months off. If they're, say, a salesperson and they earn commission, you would include the commission in their average weekly earnings. So when they take long service leave, you include the commission. But when they are paid out the long service leave on termination, for example, you don't include the commission in the calculation. Now, that's, again, something that very difficult for a payroll system to automate that. So that's just something that every payroll person needs to know about the legislation in that state. And it could be different for all of the different states. And it certainly is different for all the different states. Now, the regulators in this situation are the state governments. So either state or territory government. So this is a state-based legislation, not federal-based. So, for example, your annual leave, which is generally 4 weeks a year, and your carers or sick leave, what we call personal leave now, which is generally 10 days a year, is regulated federally, but that is not the case with long service leave. The third thing I wanted to cover that we see a lot of employers get themselves into a lot of trouble is the superannuation guarantee, or SG. Now, superannuation is broadly thought of as a percentage of earnings, but it's actually not a percentage of earnings. It's a percentage, currently 10%, of what we call ordinary time earnings. So it's really important to know, as a payroll manager and a payroll officer, what is ordinary time earnings. Now, ordinary time earnings generally include the majority of the things that you're paid, the majority of the elements of pay. However, there are some exceptions, and the big one is overtime. And remember how I said that overtime is different to penalty rates. So penalty rates, you need to pay the 10% super on. Overtime, you do not. So we also see here a lot of employers overpaying superannuation because they're paying on overtime when they don't need to be. Really important that you have your payroll system set up correctly on this one, because say your overtime is 150% of ordinary time, and say you've got another penalty that's 150%, if you don't separate those two things, you'll be paying super on everything or not paying super on everything. Both cases, that is wrong. So overtime is an exclusion. I often get asked, is a car allowance ordinary time earnings? And the answer is, like most things in Australian payroll, is it depends. And the thing that car allowance depends on is the car allowance fully expended? If the car allowance is fully expended by the employee, you do not need to pay superannuation guarantee on that. If the car allowance is not fully expended, you do. And the reason for that is if I take $10,000 a year as a car allowance and I use that to run a car, it's essentially more like a reimbursement, so not requiring superannuation being payable. However, if I take a car allowance as part of my package and I choose other ways to commute and I actually don't expend it on a car, it really is like just normal salaries and wages. So that does attract superannuation. So you can see that answer is oftentimes not clear depending on how the employee is engaged or uses that pay element as to whether superannuation will be applicable. Leave loading is another one. In Australia, we have this thing for some industries, and not everyone does this, but you can pay leave loading, which is generally 17.5% on top of your standard pay when you're on leave. Now, it was historically put in place because generally, if you were regularly doing overtime, when you took annual leave, your salary, your wages would actually come down because you wouldn't be paid overtime when you were taking leave. So this concept of leave loading came in. Is it superable? Is it ordinary time earnings? It depends. So what it depends on is whether the employee taking it generally works overtime. If you generally work overtime, it's not superable. If you don't generally work overtime and you're just paid a flat salary, but you just also happen to have leave loading in your agreement, it is superable. So you could have an organisation with 1,000 employees in it, and some of them get super on their leave loading and some of them don't. So it's really important, again, to understand the legislation behind that. Another one I see organisations getting wrong all the time is on-call allowance. Is that ordinary time earnings? Well, again, it depends whether they were on call during, well, it actually depends on quite a few things. So you again need to understand why they were paid the on-call allowance and then relate that back to ordinary time earnings. There are upcoming rate increases on superannuation. So it's currently 10%, but we're moving to 12% over the next several years. So again, be aware of that. Now, the increases can be, depending on your employment contract, can be absorbed, but it really does depend on the language in your employment contract. So don't just think that it goes from 10 to 11%. A lot of employers in Australia are actually absorbing that into the employee's base salary. Not necessarily something that I encourage, but it is legally acceptable. Now, the regulator of superannuation is the Australian Tax Office. So you can see we've got three different areas that I've talked about already, and that it awards superannuation and long service leave, three different regulators. So that's another reason why Australian payroll is so incredibly complex. Now, there are some other things that you should be mindful of. I said I'd only talk about three, but I really want to very quickly just touch on a couple of other things. Termination calculation and payments, incredibly complicated in Australia. We have, for example, quite a complicated spreadsheet that our members require to calculate termination payments and all the tax relating to them. So lots of legislation regarding that. And also just be aware of the rates and thresholds that may change every year. Now, these include the quarterly superannuation caps. There is a cap on superannuation and it is managed quarterly. So you might have a situation where you pay an annual bonus, and that bonus might gobble up all of the superannuation, the quarterly superannuation cap. So it may well be if you're paying superannuation for the quarter January through March, and you're paid a bonus in January, you may not get any superannuation in February and March because your bonus might be so large to actually take that entire quarterly superannuation cap. So just be mindful of that. We see a lot of employers not just underpaying super, but overpaying it. Payroll tax for each states, and whether you're regional or non-regional, those thresholds change every year. Award rates and age increments also change every year. Things like child support protected earnings is something that not only changes every year, but can change throughout the year. In fact, on the 1st of January, that has changed. Doesn't even need to link to a financial year. And also the national minimum wage is always announced just before the beginning of every financial year, normally sometime in June. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight as to the complexities in Australian payroll. As I say, any one of these things, our long service leave course is 4 hours. That's just on long service leave. So it's incredibly complicated. We have a lot of information on our website, a lot of free content, a lot of articles. So if you'd like any further information on Australian payroll, please visit our website, which is austpayroll.com.au. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.